"Grandma, don't drink it," Lily whispered. But I had already taken a sip, and the sweetness hit my tongue first, followed by something I couldn't quite place, something faint and wrong, like a memory you try to ignore but can't shake. And when I looked up, Emily was watching me, her smile too tight, her eyes fixed on my face as if she was waiting for a reaction. And in that moment, I understood something without knowing why, that this wasn't just juice, and this wasn't just a normal afternoon in my son's house. And whatever I had just tasted was only the beginning of something much bigger than I was prepared for. I'm Margaret Collins. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived long enough to know when something in a room shifts, even if no one else feels it yet. The kitchen looked the same as it always did, spotless counters, sunlight pouring through the window over the sink, the faint hum of the refrigerator. But there was a tension in the air that didn't belong, the kind of silence that sits between people when something is being hidden. Lily stood beside me, her small hand gripping the edge of the table, her eyes wide, not playful, not curious, but afraid, and that alone told me more than any words could have. Emily turned away too quickly, picking up a dish that didn't need moving, her movements sharp, controlled, like someone trying too hard to appear normal. Daniel sat at the table scrolling through his phone, barely glancing up, the same way he had been for months now, present but not really there. And I felt that familiar ache settle in my chest, the one that had been growing ever since my husband passed 2 years ago, the one that came from realizing your place in a family can quietly disappear without anyone saying a word. I set the glass down carefully, not making a scene, not asking questions, because I've learned that people reveal more when you stay quiet. "It's good," I said softly, even though it wasn't, even though the taste lingered in a way that made me uneasy. Lily's eyes flickered to mine, searching, as if she was waiting for me to say something else, something that would make sense of what she already seemed to know. But I didn't. Not yet, because I needed to understand first. I needed to see. Emily finally spoke, her voice light, almost too light. "She's been so picky lately. I have to make sure she gets her vitamins somehow," she said with a small laugh, and Daniel nodded without looking up. "Yeah, Mom, Emily's been doing a great job keeping things together around here." And there it was, the quiet shift of power. The way my son spoke about his own home as if he were a guest in it, as if everything important passed through his wife first. I had seen it happen slowly over the years, small changes, decisions made without me, traditions forgotten, conversations that stopped when I entered the room, and I had told myself it was just life moving forward, just the natural distance that comes with time. But standing there in that kitchen, with that strange taste still on my tongue and that look in my granddaughter's eyes, I felt something else take shape, something colder, more deliberate. I watched as Emily took the glass from the counter, rinsed it quickly, too quickly, and placed it upside down in the rack, her back turned to me, her shoulders slightly tense, and I noticed how Lily didn't reach for another drink, how she stayed close to me instead, as if proximity alone could keep her safe. "Grandma," she said again, quieter this time, barely audible. "Did it taste funny?" And I knelt slightly so I could meet her eyes. Those same blue eyes my son had as a child. Eyes that had once looked at me with complete trust. "Why would you ask that, sweetheart?" I said gently, and she hesitated, glancing over at her mother, who was now busy wiping a perfectly clean counter. "Because it always does," she whispered, and the words settled over me like a slow, creeping chill. I straightened up, keeping my expression calm, controlled, because whatever this was, it wasn't something I could confront in the middle of this kitchen, not without knowing more, not without understanding what I was stepping into. "I think I'll take a little walk later," I said, casually, turning toward my purse. "Get some fresh air." Emily glanced back at me, just for a second, but it was enough to see the flicker of something in her eyes. Something that didn't belong in a daughter-in-law looking at her husband's mother. Something sharp and calculating, and she smiled again, that same practice smile. "Of course, Margaret, you should," she said, her tone polite, perfect, and completely empty. I nodded, slipping the small container I had quietly filled from the sink into my bag when no one was looking, my movements slow, deliberate, as if nothing had changed. But everything had, because I had lived long enough to recognize the beginning of a truth that no one was willing to say out loud. And as I stepped out of that house into the afternoon sun, The warmth on my skin felt almost unreal compared to the cold certainty settling inside me. I didn't know exactly what I would find yet, but I knew this much with absolute clarity. Whatever was in that glass was never meant to be questioned, and the moment I did, I became part of something they hadn't planned for. I did not go home right away. Instead, I drove 20 minutes across town to a small clinic I had used years ago when my husband was still alive. A place quiet enough that no one would ask too many questions, and I kept my hands steady on the wheel even though my mind kept returning to the same moment. Lily's voice, soft and urgent, and the look in Emily's eyes, that brief flicker that did not belong to someone who had nothing to hide. The sun was still high when I parked, the heat pressing against the windshield, but I did not feel it. I only felt the weight of the small container in my purse, heavier than it should have been. I walked inside, greeted by the faint smell of disinfectant and the low murmur of voices behind the reception desk. Everything ordinary, everything calm, and that contrast made something inside me tighten, because whatever I had stepped into earlier that afternoon did not feel ordinary at all. The nurse at the front desk smiled politely, asked how she could help, and I found myself choosing my words carefully. "I would like to have something tested," I said, my voice even, controlled, the way it had been at my husband's funeral when everyone expected me to fall apart, and I did not. She hesitated for just a second, then nodded and handed me a form. Simple questions: name, contact information, reason for visit. And I paused at that last line longer than I should have, because how do you explain a feeling, a suspicion that has no proof yet? How do you write down that something in your own family feels wrong? I left it blank, handed it back, and took a seat. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching just enough to make me aware of it. And I watched the people around me, a young mother with a toddler, an older man flipping through a magazine. Normal lives, normal concerns, and I wondered how many of them had ever sat where I was sitting, holding something that might change everything. My name was called sooner than I expected, and I followed the nurse down a narrow hallway into a small examination room, the kind with pale walls and a single window that let in too much light. "What do we have today, Margaret?" the doctor asked as he entered, his tone friendly, familiar, and I recognized him after a moment. Dr. Harris. He had treated my husband once, years ago, when things were still simple. "I need this tested," I said, placing the container on the counter between us. He looked at it, then at me, his expression shifting slightly, curiosity replacing ease. "May I ask why?" he said, and I met his eyes, steady, calm. "Because something about it is not right," I answered, and that was enough. He did not press further. He simply nodded and began the process, efficient, methodical, the way professionals move when they are used to uncertainty. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, watching him work, and I realized how quiet my thoughts had become. No panic, no rushing conclusions, just a slow, steady awareness that whatever came next would require me to be very clear, very careful. Time passed in a way that felt both fast and stretched, the kind of time that does not move evenly. And when he finally turned back to me, holding the results, something in his face had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone else might notice, but I did, because I had spent a lifetime reading small shifts in people, the kind that reveal more than words ever do. He did not speak. Right away, he looked at the paper, then at me, then back again, and the silence settled between us. Heavy, deliberate. "Doctor," I said quietly, and he exhaled, slow, measured, as if choosing each word before he allowed it out. "Margaret, where did you get this?" he asked, and there it was, not an answer, but a question that told me everything I needed to know about the direction we were heading, from my son's house. I replied, keeping my voice steady. "My granddaughter was drinking it." His jaw tightened slightly, just enough, and he set the paper down on the counter instead of handing it to me. A small action, but one that carried weight. "Is she drinking this regularly?" he asked, and I thought of Lily's whisper, of the way she had said it always tasted funny, and I felt that same cold certainty settle deeper. "Yes," I said, "every day." The room seemed quieter after that, as if even the air had paused, and he nodded once, slowly, before finally speaking. "There are compounds in this that should not be there," he said carefully, "not in something given to a child on a daily basis." I did not react, not outwardly. I simply listened, because this was the moment where panic would make everything worse. What kind of compounds? I asked, and he hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it. They are not immediately dangerous in small amounts, he said. But over time, they can affect energy levels, focus, overall strength. They can make someone more dependent, more manageable. The word lingered in the air, and I understood exactly what he was trying not to say. I looked at the paper then, finally. The lines of data that meant little to most people, but meant everything in this moment. And I felt something inside me shift, not break, not collapse, but harden, settle into place. If a child has been consuming this for months, what would happen? I asked, and his expression softened, not with pity, but with concern. It would not be obvious at first, he said. Just fatigue, maybe difficulty concentrating, things that could easily be explained away. But over time, it could create a pattern, one that would make the child seem naturally weaker then. They are. I nodded slowly, each word fitting into the pieces already forming in my mind. The missed school days, the quietness, the way Lily stayed close, the way Emily always had an explanation ready, always had a reason. Can it be stopped? I asked, and he met my eyes directly now. Yes, he said firmly. If it is identified and removed, the effects can be reversed, especially at her age. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, but it did not bring relief. Not yet, because knowing the truth was only the beginning, not the end. I reached for the container, sliding it back into my purse, my movements calm, deliberate. Thank you, doctor, I said, standing, and he hesitated again. Margaret, he said, if there is someone responsible for this, it needs to be addressed carefully. I paused at the door, my hand on the handle, and allowed myself a small, quiet acknowledgement of what I already knew. I understand, I said, and I did, more than he realized, because this was not just about what was in that glass. This was about control, about manipulation that had been unfolding quietly, patiently, inside a home I used to feel welcome in. And as I stepped back into the sunlight, the world looked the same. Cars passing, people walking, life moving forward without hesitation. But for me, everything had shifted, because now I was not just a grandmother visiting for dinner. I was the only person who knew what was really happening to that little girl, and more importantly, I knew exactly who had made it happen. I did not go back the next day, or the day after that, because rushing would have been a mistake, and I had made enough mistakes in my life to know that truth needs space to reveal itself properly. So instead I waited, I watched, and I thought. I sat in my small living room with the results folded neatly on the table in front of me. Not hidden, not displayed, just present. Like a quiet reminder that what I felt in that kitchen had not been imagination. It had been instinct, and instinct, in my experience, was rarely wrong. I replayed everything in my mind, not just the moment with the juice, but the months before it, the small things I had dismissed. At the time, because they seemed too insignificant to question, Lily canceling visits because she was tired, Emily explaining it away with a gentle smile, Daniel agreeing without hesitation, the way Lily would sit close to me whenever I visited, not restless like children usually are, but still observant, as if she was measuring something, waiting for something. I remembered one afternoon about 6 months ago when Lily had fallen asleep on the couch in the middle of the day, her small body curled up, her breathing shallow but steady, and Emily had laughed lightly, saying she had been playing too hard. But even then something about it had not felt right. Children do not just fade like that without reason. And now, sitting there with the truth in front of me, every one of those moments began to align, not as separate incidents, but as a pattern, a quiet, controlled pattern that had been building over time. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street, at the neighbors going about their day, and I wondered how many lives looked normal from the outside while something entirely different unfolded behind closed doors. I did not feel anger the way people expect in situations like this. I felt clarity, sharp and steady, because anger rushes, but clarity waits, and I needed to wait. I needed to understand not just what Emily was doing, but how long it had been happening and why. And most importantly, how to stop it without giving her the chance to twist the story into something else. Because people like Emily do not react loudly. They react strategically. They prepare. They redirect. They make others question what they saw and what they heard, and I could not afford to give her that advantage. 2 days later, I returned to the house, Not unannounced, not confrontational, just a simple visit, the kind that should not raise suspicion. Emily opened the door with that same practiced smile. Warm on the surface, empty underneath. "Margaret, what a nice surprise," she said, stepping aside to let me in, and I stepped into the same kitchen, the same sunlight, the same quiet hum. But this time I saw everything differently, not as a guest, but as someone who knew where to look. Lily was at the table with a coloring book, her small fingers moving slowly, carefully, and when she saw me, her face brightened just enough to confirm what I already knew. She felt safer when I was there. "Grandma," she said. And this time there was no whisper, just a quiet relief. I sat beside her, placing my hand gently on her shoulder. "What are you drawing?" I asked, keeping my tone light. Normal, because nothing about this moment could feel different. "Not yet." "A house," she said. And I looked at the page, a simple drawing. But the figures inside it were small, smaller than they should have been, and I noticed how the figure that was supposed to be her stood slightly apart from the others, not outside, but not fully inside either, and I felt that same cold understanding settle deeper. Emily moved around the kitchen, preparing something, her movements efficient, controlled, and I watched without appearing to watch, noting how she reached for a bottle from the cabinet, how she measured something into a glass, how she stirred it carefully before placing it on the table in front of Lily. "Drink this before it gets warm," she said casually, and Lily hesitated, just for a second, her eyes flickering toward me, and I smiled gently, reassuring, because fear in that moment would only make things worse. "Go ahead, sweetheart," I said softly, and she picked up the glass, bringing it to her lips, and I felt my hands remain perfectly still in my lap, even though every instinct in me wanted to stop her, because stopping her without a plan would only alert Emily, and once alerted, she would adapt, and I needed her to believe that nothing had changed, that I was still the same quiet, observant mother she had learned to overlook. Daniel walked in then, his presence filling the room without actually changing anything. He kissed Emily on the cheek, asked about dinner, glanced at Lily briefly, and then at me. "Mom, you should come by more often," he said, and I looked at him, really looked at him, trying to find the boy I had raised in the man standing in front of me, but all I saw was distance, not cruelty, not intention, just absence, the kind that allows things to happen because it is easier not to see them. "Maybe I will," I replied, my voice calm, even, and Emily smiled again, satisfied, because as far as she could tell, everything was still under her control, and that was exactly what I needed her to believe, because the moment she realized I knew, the game would change, and I was not ready for that yet. Not until I had everything I needed. Not until I could make sure that when the truth finally came to light, there would be no room for doubt, no space for excuses, no way for her to rewrite what had been happening in that house for far too long. And as I sat there, watching Lily finish the last of that glass, I made a quiet decision, one that did not need to be spoken out loud to be real. I would not confront Emily in anger. I would not argue. I would not accuse. I would do something far more effective. I would let her continue, just long enough for the truth to become undeniable. And when that moment came, I would be ready. Not as a guest in that house, but as the one person she had underestimated from the very beginning. I did not say anything that afternoon. Not when Emily handed Lily the glass. Not when Lily drank it slowly while glancing at me between each sip. And not when Daniel laughed at something on his phone as if nothing in that room carried any weight at all. Because silence, I had learned, can be more powerful than questions, and questions asked too early often lead to answers that are carefully prepared. I stayed for another hour, long enough to make everything feel ordinary, long enough for Emily to relax into her routine again. And when I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door with that same polite warmth. "Come by again soon," she said, and I nodded, meeting her eyes just long enough to let her believe I saw nothing, understood nothing, suspected nothing, and that was exactly what I needed her to think, because the moment someone like Emily feels observed, she changes her behavior, she adapts, she becomes harder to read, and I could not afford that, not now, not when I was only beginning to understand the full shape of what she had been doing. I drove home slowly, not because of traffic, but because my mind was already moving ahead, mapping out what needed to happen next. And for the first time since I had walked into that clinic, I allowed myself to consider not just the problem, but the solution. I could not simply confront her. That would give her the opportunity to deny, to deflect, to turn Daniel against me by making me seem paranoid or confused, and I knew how easily that could happen. I had seen it before in smaller ways, in the way my opinions had been quietly dismissed over the years, in the way Emily had learned to frame every disagreement as concern, every boundary as overreaction. No, confrontation without proof would only strengthen her position. I needed something else, something undeniable, something that could not be explained away or softened with words. I needed time, and more importantly, I needed patterns. Over the next few days, I adjusted my routine. I called ahead before visiting, always at slightly different times, sometimes in the morning, sometimes late in the afternoon, never giving enough notice for anything to be fully prepared. And each time, Emily welcomed me with the same controlled smile, the same effortless composure, but I began to notice the details that had once escaped me. The way she always positioned herself between me and the kitchen cabinets, the way she reached for the same bottle without hesitation, the way Lily's behavior shifted depending on whether that glass was in front of her or not. On the third visit, I arrived just as Lily was finishing her homework, her pencil moving slowly across the page, her shoulders slightly slumped. "How was school today?" I asked, taking a seat beside her, and she shrugged. A small, tired movement that did not match the energy a child her age should have. "It was okay," she said, but her voice lacked the usual spark, and I felt that same quiet confirmation settle deeper inside me. Emily appeared moments later, wiping her hands on a towel. "She has been working so hard lately," she said, her tone light, almost proud. "Sometimes she just gets a little worn out," and Daniel, as always, nodded in agreement from the living room. "Yeah, she has a lot on her plate," he added, without looking up, and I watched them both, not reacting, not challenging, just observing, because the consistency of their responses was part of the pattern too, the same explanation, the same tone, the same dismissal of anything that might raise a question. "Why do not we take a little break?" I said gently, turning back to Lily. "Maybe a walk outside." And for a moment, something brightened in her expression, something hopeful. But it faded quickly when Emily spoke again. "She still needs to finish her drink first," she said, placing the glass in front of Lily. And there it was again, that small but firm control, the condition attached to something simple. Lily glanced at me, then at the glass, and I could see the hesitation, the quiet resistance she did not yet have the words to express. "It is just juice," Emily added with a soft laugh, as if anticipating any concern before it could even be voiced, and I smiled in return. "Just enough, just right." "Of course," I said, because the last thing I needed was for Emily to sense a shift in me. Lily lifted the glass again, slower this time, and I watched carefully, not just her, but Emily, the way her attention sharpened, the way her posture changed ever so slightly, as if this small act mattered more than anything else happening in the room. And that told me more than any test result ever could, because control is not just about action, it is about focus, about where a person places their attention when they think no one is watching. That evening, after I returned home, I wrote everything down, not in dramatic language, not in accusations, but in simple observations, times, behaviors, reactions, patterns, because memory can be challenged, but details, consistent and repeated, are harder to dismiss. I noted when the drinks were given, how often, how Lily responded, how Emily behaved, how Daniel remained distant from it all, and as the list grew, so did the clarity of what I was dealing with. This was not careless, it was not accidental, it was structured, deliberate, sustained, an understanding that changed something in me, not my resolve, but my approach, because I was no longer dealing with a possibility, I was dealing with a certainty, and certainty requires precision. The next step would not be emotional, it would be strategic. I would need someone else to see what I had seen, someone who could confirm it in a way that could not be questioned or dismissed, and I already knew who that would be. But before I involved anyone else, I needed one more piece, one moment that would connect everything in a way that could not be undone. And as I closed my notebook and set it beside the test results, I realized that I was no longer reacting to what was happening in that house. I was preparing for the moment when it would finally be revealed, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a truth so clear that no one in that room would be able to look away from it. The next piece did not come from the house. It came from Lily, and it came when Emily was not in the room, which is often when the truth chooses to show itself. I had timed my visit carefully that day, arriving just after Daniel left for work and before Emily settled fully into her routine. The house felt quieter, less controlled, like something had loosened slightly. Lily was sitting at the kitchen table again, but this time there was no glass in front of her, just a small bowl of cereal she had barely touched. "Good morning, sweetheart," I said softly, and she looked up at me with that same mixture of relief and hesitation, as if she wanted to speak but did not yet know how. I sat down across from her, not too close, not too far, giving her space the way you do when you are waiting for someone to come toward you on their own. "Did you sleep well?" I asked, and she nodded, then shook her head, a small contradiction that did not need to be explained because I understood it already. Children often answer with what they think is expected before they allow themselves to be honest. I smiled gently. "Sometimes I say yes when I really mean no too," I told her, and that was enough. Just enough for her shoulders to relax, just enough for her to feel safe in a way she had not been allowed to feel consistently. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice even though no one else was there. "Grandma," she said, "do you ever feel tired even when you are not supposed to be?" And the question settled into me slowly, not as a surprise, but as confirmation. "Sometimes," I said, keeping my tone calm, steady. "Why do you ask?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the table. "Because I do," she whispered, "all the time." And I did not interrupt, I did not rush to fill the silence, because silence invites more truth, and she needed to feel that she could continue. "Mom says it is because I am growing," she added, "but it does not feel like that." I nodded slowly, encouraging without pushing. "What does it feel like?" I asked, and she searched for the words, her brow furrowing slightly. "Like I am slower," she said finally. "Like I am trying to think, but it takes longer." And I felt that same quiet clarity sharpen inside me. Not anger, not fear, just a precise understanding of what was being described. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. Light, reassuring. "Thank you for telling me," I said softly. And she looked at me as if she had been waiting for that exact response. Not dismissal, not explanation, just acknowledgement. Footsteps sounded from down the hall, and Lily pulled her hand back quickly, her posture straightening, her expression shifting into something more neutral. And in that moment, I saw the difference between who she was when she felt safe and who she had learned to be when she did not. Emily entered the kitchen with her usual composure, her hair perfectly in place, her movements smooth, practiced. "Oh, Margaret, you are here early," she said with a pleasant smile, and I returned it just as easily. "I thought I would spend some extra time with Lily today," I replied, and for a fraction of a second, something tightened in her expression, so slight it could be missed, but I saw it, because I was looking for it. "Of course," she said, recovering quickly. "She has been a little low on energy lately, so do not wear her out." And there it was again, the narrative already prepared, already in place. I nodded as if I accepted it without question. "We will take it easy," I said, and Emily moved toward the cabinet, reaching for the same bottle I had seen every time, her hand steady, confident, and I watched without appearing to watch, noting how she poured, how she measured, how she stirred, each movement consistent with the pattern I had been documenting. She placed the glass in front of Lily. "Drink this first," she said gently, and Lily's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. That same hesitation, that same quiet resistance. I leaned back in my chair, my expression calm, my presence unchanged, because this moment needed to unfold exactly as it always did. Lily lifted the glass, her eyes flickering toward me for just a second, and I gave the smallest nod, not permission, but reassurance, and she drank, slowly, carefully, and I watched Emily again, not the act itself, but the attention, the focus, the way her entire awareness centered on that one small action. And in that moment, everything aligned completely, not just the test results, not just the patterns, but the intent behind it all, because intent reveals itself in what people watch, in what they wait for, in what they cannot look away from. And Emily could not look away from that glass, not until it was empty. "Good girl," she said softly when Lily finished, her tone warm, approving. And I felt something settle into place inside me, something final, because this was no longer about suspicion or interpretation. This was confirmation, clear and undeniable. I stood slowly, reaching for my purse. I think I will take Lily for that walk now, I said, my voice even, natural, and Emily hesitated, just for a moment, weighing something internally, before nodding. That sounds nice, she said, stepping back, and I took Lily's hand, guiding her toward the door. Feeling the lightness in her step the moment we moved outside, away from the kitchen, away from the glass, away from the quiet control that had defined her space. And as we walked down the sidewalk together, the air felt different, not because anything had changed around us, but because I now knew exactly what I was dealing with, and more. Importantly, I knew that the next move would not be hers, it would be mine. We did not walk far, just to the end of the block and back, because it was not the distance that mattered, it was the space away from that kitchen, away from that glass, away from the quiet pressure that seemed to follow Lily wherever she went inside that house. And as we walked, I noticed something that made everything even clearer. Her steps became lighter, her pace quicker, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else might notice, but enough to tell me that what I had been told about her being naturally tired did not match what I was seeing now. Do you like walking outside? I asked gently, and she nodded, a small smile appearing. I feel better out here, she said, and I did not need to ask why, because I already knew. I let the silence stretch for a moment, not empty, but calm, the kind of silence that allows a child to think without fear of being corrected. Grandma, she said after a while, do I have to drink that every day? And I slowed my steps slightly, turning to look at her, really look at her, not just as my granddaughter, but as someone who had been trying to understand something she did not have the words for. What do you think? I asked softly, and she looked down at the sidewalk, her shoe tracing a small line along the concrete. I do not like it, she admitted. It makes me feel weird. And there it was again, that honest description, simple but precise, the kind that does not come from imagination, but from experience. I reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face. Thank you for telling me, I said, and she looked up at me, searching. Am I in trouble? She asked quietly, and something inside me tightened at that question, not because of fear, but because of what it revealed. No, I said firmly, my voice calm but clear. You are not in trouble, not at all, she nodded slowly, as if that answer mattered more than anything else. And we continued walking, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the sidewalk, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to think beyond observation, beyond confirmation, into action, because now I had more than evidence. I had her words, her experience, her trust, and that changed everything. When we returned to the house, Emily was waiting in the doorway, her posture relaxed, but her eyes immediately scanning us, taking in the details, measuring something silently. That was quick, she said with a light smile, and I returned it just as easily. Just a short walk, I replied, guiding Lily inside, and I noticed how Emily's gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary, as if she was trying to detect any shift, any sign that something had changed, but there was nothing for her to see, because I had learned long ago that the most effective response is often the one that reveals nothing at all. I think I will stay for dinner, I added casually, and that was new, not something I had done recently, and for the first time, I saw a slight pause in her reaction, not resistance, but calculation. Of course, she said, stepping aside. That would be nice, and I knew then that this was the moment I had been waiting for, not because I was ready to confront her, but because I was ready to observe something specific, something I had not yet seen clearly, how this pattern extended beyond a single moment, beyond a single glass, into the rhythm of the entire household. Dinner was prepared as it always was, efficient, quiet, controlled. Emily moved through the kitchen with practiced ease. Daniel set the table without looking up from his phone for more than a second at a time, and Lily sat in her chair, her movements small, contained, and I took my place at the table, not as a guest, not as an observer, but as someone who was now fully aware of the structure around her. The plates were set, the food served, and then, just as I expected, Emily reached for the bottle again, pouring a measured amount into a glass, stirring it with the same careful motion, and placing it beside Lily's plate. "Finish this before you eat," she said gently, and Lily's hand paused midair, her eyes flickering toward me again, and I held her gaze for just a second, steady, reassuring, not instructing, not intervening, because this moment was not about stopping the action. It was about confirming the pattern in a setting where it could not be dismissed as coincidence. Lily lifted the glass, slower than before, and I watched Emily, not Lily, because Lily's reaction I already understood. It was Emily's that mattered now. The way her attention sharpened again, the way her posture aligned, the way her focus narrowed to that single act. And in that moment, everything became undeniable, not just to me, but in a way that could be shown, demonstrated, proven, because repetition creates evidence, and evidence creates truth that cannot be rewritten. Lily drank, setting the empty glass down quietly, and Emily's shoulders relaxed just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to tell me that this was not routine, this was intention. And I sat there, my hands resting calmly in my lap, my expression unchanged, but inside, something had shifted completely, not in a way that felt sudden, but in a way that felt final, because I now had everything I needed: the results, the pattern, the behavior, and most importantly, the child's own voice. And as Daniel began talking about something from work, unaware of everything unfolding around him, I realized that the next step would not be about watching anymore. It would be about showing, not just telling, not just accusing, but placing the truth in front of them in a way that could not be ignored. And as I looked across the table at Emily, who believed she still controlled every detail in that room, I understood something with absolute clarity. She had been very careful, very consistent, very controlled, but she had overlooked one thing. She had assumed that no one was paying close enough attention, and that was the mistake I was about to turn into her undoing. That night, I did not sleep the way I used to, not deeply, not without interruption, but not because I was afraid. It was because my mind had already moved ahead to what needed to happen next. And once a decision settles into place, it does not leave room for rest. It sharpens everything instead. I sat at my kitchen table long after the house grew quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound, and I laid everything out in front of me, not dramatically, not like evidence in a courtroom, but simply, clearly, the test results, my notes, the small container I had kept, and I looked at them the way you look at something you already understand but need to confirm one last time, not for yourself, but for what comes next, because knowing the truth and proving the truth are two very different things. And I needed proof that could not be questioned, not by Emily, not by Daniel, not by anyone. The next morning I made a call, not to confront, not to accuse, but to prepare. Dr. Harris answered on the second ring, his voice calm, professional, and I explained what I needed without embellishment, without emotion, just facts, clear and direct. And there was a pause on the other end, not hesitation, but consideration. "If you want this addressed properly," he said finally, "it needs to be done in a way that cannot be dismissed." And I nodded, even though he could not see me. "That is exactly what I intend," I replied. We spoke briefly about what would be required, what could be observed, what could be confirmed in real time. And when I hung up, I felt something settle inside me. Not relief, not yet, but readiness, because now there was a path, not just an understanding. Later that day, I called Daniel, something I had not done in weeks. "I was thinking we could all have dinner together tomorrow," I said, keeping my tone light. "Familiar. It has been a while." There was a brief pause, the kind that comes when someone is not used to being invited. "Yeah, sure, Mom," he said, distracted, but agreeable. "Emily will like that." And I let that statement pass without comment, because whether she liked it or not was no longer relevant. "I will bring dessert," I added, and that was enough to make it feel ordinary, expected, something that did not require suspicion. The next evening I arrived at the house at exactly 6 o'clock, not early, not late, carrying a small cake in one hand and my purse in the other. Everything about my appearance and my timing was intentional, controlled, because normalcy would be my greatest advantage. Emily opened the door with her usual composure, her smile perfectly in place. "Margaret, this is a nice surprise," she said, though I had called ahead, and I returned the smile just as easily. "I thought we could have a proper dinner together," I replied, stepping inside. and I felt it immediately. That same atmosphere, that same quiet tension beneath the surface, unchanged, consistent, predictable, which was exactly what I needed. Dinner began as it always did. Casual conversation, small details, Daniel talking about work, Emily responding with practiced interest, Lily quiet but present. And I took my place at the table, observing without appearing to observe, waiting for the moment I knew would come, and it did. As reliably as before, Emily stood, moved to the cabinet, reached for the bottle, poured the liquid into a glass, stirred it carefully, and placed it in front of Lily. "Drink this first," she said, her tone gentle, controlled. And Lily's hand hesitated just slightly before reaching for it. And I watched Emily, not Lily. Because Lily's behavior was no longer the question, Emily's was. And just as before, her attention sharpened, her posture aligned, her focus narrowed. And that was when I spoke, not loudly, not abruptly, but clearly enough to shift the air in the room. "Actually, I would like to try that first," I said, my voice calm, steady. And for the first time since I had begun this process, everything changed, not outwardly, not dramatically, but in the smallest, most revealing ways. Emily's hand paused. Mid-motion, her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, and Daniel looked up from his plate, confused. "Mom," he said, and I met his eyes briefly before turning back to Emily. "It looks like something special," I added, my tone light, almost curious, as if this was nothing more than a simple request. But I held her gaze, not challenging, not aggressive, just present, and that was enough. Because people like Emily rely on control, on predictability, on patterns that no one interrupts. And in that moment, I had interrupted the pattern, and she had not prepared for that. "It is just Lily's supplement," she said, recovering quickly, her voice smooth. "It would not really be suitable for you," and I smiled slightly. "Then it should be even more important that we understand exactly what it is," I replied, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, filled with something that had not existed in that room before, uncertainty. Daniel shifted in his seat, glancing between us. "What is going on?" he asked, and I reached into my purse slowly, deliberately, not rushing, not hesitating, and I placed the folded paper from the clinic on the table in front of me, not pushing it toward anyone, not explaining it, just letting it exist there, visible, undeniable. "I think it is time we all understand what has been happening here," I said quietly, and for the first time, Emily did not move, did not speak, did not smile. She simply stood there, looking at the paper, and in that stillness, everything she had built so carefully began to shift, not because I had accused her, not because I had raised my voice, but because I had brought the truth into the room, and once the truth is present, it does not need to be forced, it only needs to be seen. No one reached for the paper at first, not Daniel, not Emily, not even Lily, because the presence of something unknown often creates a pause before reaction. And I let that pause exist. I did not rush to explain. I did not fill the silence, because silence has a way of forcing people to confront what they would rather avoid. Daniel was the first to move, slowly, uncertainly, picking up the folded sheet and opening it with the kind of hesitation that comes when you already sense the answer will not be simple. His eyes scanned the page, once, then again, slower the second time, and I watched the shift happen, not dramatic, not immediate, but gradual, the way understanding settles into someone who was not expecting it. "What is this?" he asked finally, his voice lower than before, and I answered without raising mine. "It is the result of what has been in that glass," I said, and I gestured lightly toward the table, toward the empty space where the drink had been. Emily moved then, just slightly, her posture straightening, her expression returning to something composed, something practiced. "Margaret, I think this is a misunderstanding," she said smoothly, and there it was, the first attempt, not denial, not yet, but redirection. "It is just a supplement, something recommended to help with Lily's energy." And Daniel looked at her, searching for reassurance, for a version of reality that felt easier to accept. But I did not interrupt. I did not challenge her directly, because this was not the moment for argument. This was the moment for clarity. "Then it should match what is written there," I said calmly, and Daniel's gaze returned to the paper, his brow tightening slightly as he read again, more carefully this time. "These are not vitamins," he said slowly. almost to himself, and the room shifted again, subtly but unmistakably. Emily's smile did not disappear, but it changed, becoming thinner, more controlled. "You are not a doctor, Daniel," she replied gently. "Those reports can be confusing if you do not understand them." And I reached into my purse once more, not hurried, not hesitant, and placed my phone on the table, screen facing up, already dialed, already waiting. "Then perhaps we should hear it from someone who does," I said. And at that exact moment, the voice came through the speaker, clear, professional, unmistakable. "This is Dr. Harris," he said, and Daniel froze, his hand still resting on the paper. Emily did not move, not outwardly, but I saw it, the slight tightening in her shoulders, the shift in her breathing, the moment where control begins to slip. "Doctor," I said evenly, "could you please explain what was found in that sample?" There was no hesitation on the other end, no uncertainty, just a clear, measured explanation. "The sample contains compounds that are not typically present in nutritional supplements, especially not for a child," he said. "In repeated doses, these compounds can affect cognitive clarity, energy levels, and overall responsiveness." And the words settled into the room with a weight that could not be redirected, could not be softened. Daniel looked up then, his eyes moving from the phone to Emily, confusion giving way to something sharper, something more focused. "Emily," he said, and for the first time, her composure faltered just enough to be visible, just enough to confirm what had already been proven. "There must be some mistake," she said, but her voice no longer carried the same effortless confidence. It carried something else now, something strained. I followed the recommendations exactly. And I watched her carefully, not her words, but her reaction, the way she chose her phrasing, the way she avoided specifics, because truth tends to be direct, and avoidance tends to circle. "What recommendations?" I asked quietly, and she paused, just for a moment. And that pause was louder than any answer could have been. Daniel's expression changed again, the pieces beginning to align in a way that could not be undone. "Emily, what is she talking about?" he asked, his voice no longer uncertain, but demanding clarity, and Lily, who had been silent through all of this, shifted in her seat, her small hands resting in her lap, her eyes moving between us, and I reached out gently, placing my hand over hers, not to guide her, not to direct her, but simply to let her know that she was not alone in this moment. Because this moment was not just about exposure, it was about protection, and as the silence stretched again, heavier now, filled with something that could no longer be ignored, I understood that everything had changed, not because of what I had said, but because of what could no longer be denied. Emily had built her control on the assumption that no one would question her, that no one would look closely enough, that no one would connect the details. But she had not accounted for what happens when someone does. When someone watches, listens, and waits long enough to see the pattern clearly. And as I looked across the table at her, I did not feel anger. I did not feel triumph. I felt something much simpler, much colder. I felt certainty, because the truth was no longer something I carried alone. It was now in the room, visible, undeniable. And once truth reaches that point, it does not need to be defended. It simply needs to be acknowledged. And whether she chose to admit it or not, whether she chose to explain or deflect, it no longer mattered, because the one thing she could not do anymore was hide it. Daniel did not speak right away after the doctor's voice faded from the phone, and that silence was different from the ones before. This one was not confusion. It was realization trying to take shape, slow and uncomfortable, like something he had avoided seeing finally stepping into focus. He looked down at the paper again, then at the empty space where the glass had been, and then back at Emily. But this time his expression was not searching for reassurance. It was searching for truth. "Emily," he said again, quieter now, but far more direct. "What is in that drink?" And I watched her carefully, not expecting an immediate confession, because people who build control over time do not surrender it easily. They shift, they adjust, they look for another way to hold the narrative, and she did exactly that. She took a slow breath, her shoulders settling, her voice softening just enough to sound reasonable. "I told you, it is something to help her," she said. "She has been struggling, Daniel. You know that." And he hesitated, just for a second, because doubt does not disappear instantly. It lingers, it resists, it looks for familiar ground to return to. But the paper was still in his hand, and the doctor's words were still in the air, and those things do not disappear just because they are inconvenient. Help her with what? He asked, and this time there was no distraction in his voice, no distance, just a clear demand for an answer. Emily's eyes flickered, not toward me, but toward Lily, and that alone told me everything I needed to know about where her leverage had always been. She gets overwhelmed, Emily said. She has trouble focusing. She gets tired. I was trying to stabilize things for her. And the explanation was almost convincing if you did not know what to look for, if you did not understand how easily concern can be used to mask control. But Daniel did not look convinced anymore. He looked uncertain in a different way now, not uncertain of me, but uncertain of her. By giving her something every day without telling me, he asked, and there it was, the first crack, not in her story, but in his trust. And once that cracks, everything else begins to shift. Lily shifted in her seat then, her small voice breaking through the tension in a way that no adult could have controlled. It makes me feel slow, she said quietly, and the room stilled completely, because truth spoken simply, without strategy, without intention, carries a weight that no explanation can easily counter. Daniel turned toward her immediately, his expression softening but sharpening at the same time. What do you mean, slow? He asked gently, and she looked down at her hands. Like I cannot think fast, she said. Like I want to answer in class, but it takes too long. And I felt my hand tighten slightly around hers, not to guide her, not to stop her, but to steady her, because this moment belonged to her as much as it did to anyone else. Emily stepped forward then, her tone shifting again, more urgent now. She is exaggerating. Daniel, children do that, she said quickly. And that was the mistake, not the words themselves, but the speed, the need to interrupt. Because truth does not rush, only fear does. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and I saw something change in his eyes, something that had not been there before, not anger, not yet, but recognition, the kind that comes when pieces finally connect. You said this was just vitamins, he said slowly. You never said anything about this. And he gestured toward the paper, toward the weight of what it represented. And Emily hesitated again, just long enough, just clearly enough, and in that hesitation, the balance in the room shifted completely. I did not speak. I did not need to, because this was no longer my moment to explain. It was his moment to see, and seeing, once it begins, is very hard to stop. The silence stretched, heavier now, filled with everything that had been hidden, everything that had been overlooked, and I realized something important in that moment. This was not just about exposing Emily. It was about giving Daniel the space to confront what he had allowed. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but through absence, through distance, through the quiet decision not to look too closely. And as I sat there, watching him hold that realization, I understood that the next step would not come from me. It would come from him. Because once someone begins to question the foundation they have been standing on, they either step back onto it or they step away. And as Daniel looked between the paper, the glass, and his daughter, I knew he could no longer stand where he had been before, and Emily knew it too. I could see it in the way her posture shifted, in the way her confidence no longer sat as easily as it had before, because control depends on certainty, and certainty had just been taken from her. And in that quiet, undeniable shift, the outcome was no longer something she could shape. It was something she would have to face. Daniel stood up slowly, not abruptly, not in anger, but in a way that made the chair scrape just enough against the floor to break whatever illusion of normalcy had been holding that room together. And for a moment no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed to be said had already begun to take shape. How long? He asked finally, his voice steady but heavier than before. And that question did not need clarification. It carried everything within it. The weight of time, the weight of trust, the weight of everything he had not seen. Emily did not answer right away, and that delay, that brief calculation, said more than any words she could have chosen. Daniel, you are overreacting, she said, her tone controlled but thinner now, less certain. I was trying to help her. You know how she has been. And he shook his head slightly, not in denial, but in rejection of something he could no longer accept. Do not tell me what I know, he said, and There was something different in his voice now, not confusion, not hesitation, but clarity, the kind that does not come quickly, but once it arrives, it does not leave. He looked at Lily again, really looked at her, and I saw it then. The shift from passive father to present one, the realization of what had been happening in front of him all along. You said she was just tired, he continued, his gaze returning to Emily. You said it was normal, and Emily took a small step back, not visibly, retreating, but adjusting, recalibrating. It is normal for children to have phases, she said, and again, the words were almost convincing if you did not listen closely. If you did not notice how they avoided the question that had actually been asked. I remained silent, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because this was no longer about presenting information. It was about allowing the truth to unfold in a way that could not be interrupted. Daniel reached for the glass then, the empty one that had been sitting beside Lily's plate, and he picked it up slowly, turning it slightly in his hand as if it might still hold some answer within it. What exactly have you been giving her? He asked, and this time his voice left no room for redirection. Emily's eyes flickered toward the cabinet, toward the bottle that had become the center of everything, and that was enough for him to follow that glance, to stand, to walk across the room, and to open the cabinet himself, something he had not done before, something that had always been handled by her. He took the bottle down, examining it, reading the label, and then looking back at the paper still resting on the table, and I watched the connection happen in real time, not dramatic, not sudden, but undeniable. This does not match, he said quietly, and the quietness of that statement carried more weight than any raised voice could have. Emily stepped forward quickly, her composure slipping just enough to reveal urgency. You do not understand what you are looking at, she said, and Daniel turned to her, holding the bottle in one hand, the paper in the other. Then explain it, he replied, and for the first time since this began, there was no immediate answer, no smooth explanation, no carefully framed response, just silence. And that silence was not strategic. It was exposed. Lily shifted again, her small voice breaking through once more, not with intention, but with honesty. I told you I do not like it, she said softly, and Daniel's expression changed again. Something deeper now, something protective. You do not have to drink anything you do not want to, he said firmly, and those words, simple as they were, carried a shift in authority that had not existed in that house before. Emily inhaled sharply, as if preparing to respond, to regain control, but the moment had already moved beyond her reach, because once a child is given a voice in front of truth, it cannot easily be taken back. I leaned forward slightly then, not to lead, not to dominate, but to place one final piece into the space that had already been opened. This was not a mistake, I said quietly, and both of them looked at me, Daniel with expectation, Emily with something else, something tighter, something more guarded. It has been consistent, I continued. Every day, same time, same behavior, same result, and I did not need to raise my voice, I did not need to add emotion, because the strength of what I was saying did not come from how it was delivered. It came from how it had been observed, documented, confirmed. Daniel's grip on the bottle tightened slightly, not aggressively, but firmly, as if he needed something physical to hold on to while everything else shifted around him. Why? He asked finally, and this time the question was not directed at me. It was directed at her, and that made all the difference, because it meant he was no longer looking for an explanation. He was demanding one. Emily opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again, and in that hesitation, that visible break in her control, everything she had built began to unravel, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a quiet, irreversible way. And as I watched it happen, I felt no satisfaction, no triumph, just a steady sense of completion, because this was never about winning. It was about stopping something that should never have been allowed to continue. And as the room settled into that new, undeniable reality, I understood that what came next would not be decided by me. It would be decided by the truth that was now impossible to ignore. Emily did not answer immediately, and this time the silence that followed Daniel's question was not strategic. It was exposed, stripped of the control she had relied on until now, and I watched her carefully, not with judgment, but with the same quiet attention I had used from the beginning, because this was the moment where Everything she had built would either hold or collapse, and she knew it. I was trying to help her, she said finally, but the words came slower now, less certain, as if even she could hear how thin they sounded against everything that had already been revealed. Daniel did not respond right away, and that pause was important because it showed he was no longer reacting to her words. He was measuring them, weighing them against what he now understood. Help her by giving her something you never told me about? He asked, his voice steady but firm, and she shook her head quickly, stepping closer, trying to close the distance. I did not think it was necessary to explain every detail, she said, and there it was again, the attempt to minimize, to reframe, but it no longer landed the way it once would have. Daniel took a step back instead of forward, creating space where there had not been any before, and that single movement said more than anything he could have spoken. It is not a detail, he replied. It is our daughter, and the word "our" carried weight now, not shared, but claimed, as if he was reclaiming something he had unknowingly allowed to slip away. Lily remained still beside me, her small hand resting under mine, and I could feel the tension in her, not fear exactly, but uncertainty, the kind that comes when the world around you shifts in a way you do not fully understand. I leaned slightly toward her, not speaking, just letting her feel that I was there, steady, unchanged, because in moments like this, stability matters more than words. Emily's composure continued to thin, not dramatically, but enough to reveal the edges beneath it. You are making this into something it is not, she said, her voice tightening slightly. I have been the one taking care of her every day, making sure she is okay, while you are busy with work and everything else. And for a brief moment, that landed, not as truth, but as a reminder of something real, because responsibility had been uneven, attention had been divided, and that is where control finds its space. But Daniel did not retreat into that. He held his ground. Taking care of her does not mean making decisions like this alone, he said, and his voice carried something new now, not just clarity, but accountability, not only directed at her, but at himself as well. I watched that carefully, because this was not just about exposing one person. It was about shifting the entire dynamic that had allowed this to happen in the first place. Emily's eyes moved again, briefly, toward the cabinet, toward the bottle, and then back to him, and I saw it. The moment where she understood that the structure she had relied on was no longer stable. You do not understand what she was like before, she said, trying one last time to anchor her position in something that could not easily be verified. She was distracted, unfocused, she could not keep up. And Lily's fingers tightened slightly under my hand, and I felt that movement, that quiet reaction, and I knew this was the moment where her voice mattered most. I liked school before, she said softly, and the simplicity of that statement cut through everything else, because it was not defensive, it was not strategic, it was just true. Daniel turned to her immediately, his expression softening again, but this time it was different. It was not distant concern, it was present, engaged. What do you mean? He asked gently, and she hesitated, then continued. I used to answer faster, she said. I used to feel normal. And that word lingered in the air, heavier than anything that had been said before, because normal is something people often do not realize they have lost until it is gone. Emily exhaled sharply, a small sound, but one that carried frustration now, not control, and she stepped back, her posture no longer centered, no longer balanced. And I saw it clearly, not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet unraveling, the kind that cannot be reversed once it begins. Daniel looked at her again, and this time there was no hesitation, no searching, just a clear, direct understanding. You should have told me, he said, and there was no accusation in his tone, just a statement of fact, and that made it even more final, because facts do not argue, they settle, and once they settle, they remain. The room grew quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, not tense, not uncertain, but resolved in a way that did not require further explanation. I sat there, my hands still, my presence steady, and I realized that my part in this was nearly complete, not because everything had been fixed, but because everything had been revealed, and sometimes that is the only thing that needs to happen for change to begin. Emily did not speak again, not immediately, and I did not expect her to, because there are moments where words no longer serve a purpose. where what has been shown is enough. And as I looked at Daniel, at Lily, and finally at her, I understood that whatever came next would not be controlled, it would be chosen, and that made all the difference. No one moved for a long moment after Daniel's words settled into the room, and that stillness was not fragile anymore. It was final, the kind of silence that comes when something has already changed and cannot return to what it was before. Emily stood there, not speaking, not correcting, not redirecting, and for the first time since I had known her, she had nothing to shape the moment with, no angle to lean on, no explanation to soften the edges, and that absence said more than anything she could have offered. Daniel slowly set the bottle back down on the counter, not with force, not with anger, but with care, as if even that small action required intention now. And he looked at Lily again, not briefly, not out of habit, but fully, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time in a long while. "You do not have to drink that anymore," he said, his voice steady, and Lily nodded, her shoulders easing just slightly. That small release enough to confirm that something important had just shifted for her, something she could not name but could feel. I withdrew my hand gently from hers, not because I needed to, but because she no longer needed me to hold it in the same way. She had been heard, and that changes how a child sits in a room, how they breathe, how they look at the people around them. Emily turned away then, not dramatically, not in defeat, but in a quiet movement that revealed more than any reaction could have. She moved toward the sink, her back to us, her posture controlled but no longer centered, and I understood that whatever she had built, whatever structure she had maintained, had already begun to come apart, not loudly, not visibly, but in a way that could not be repaired simply by speaking again. Daniel did not follow her. He remained where he was, and that choice mattered, because it showed where his attention now belonged, not divided, not distracted, but present. And I saw in that moment the beginning of something that had been missing, not perfection, not immediate understanding, but awareness. And awareness is where change begins. The room slowly returned to movement, not the same as before, but quieter, more deliberate, as if everyone was adjusting to the new shape of things. Lily picked up her fork again, this time without hesitation, and began to eat, small, steady movements that felt different now, lighter, and I watched her for a moment, allowing myself to take in that difference, not as a victory, but as a confirmation that something had been restored, even if only in part. I stood then, not abruptly, not drawing attention, just rising from my chair as if the evening had reached its natural end. "I should be going," I said calmly, and Daniel looked at me, something unspoken in his expression, something that carried both gratitude and something else, something heavier, something he would have to carry forward himself. "Mom," he said quietly, but did not finish the sentence, and he did not need to, because some things are not meant to be resolved in a single moment. Some things require time, and understanding that takes longer than acknowledgement. I nodded once, a small, steady gesture, and moved toward the door. Emily did not turn around as I passed, and I did not expect her to, because this was not a moment for reconciliation. It was a moment for truth. And truth does not always come with immediate resolution. Sometimes it simply arrives and remains, and everything else must adjust around it. I stepped outside into the evening air, the lights softer now, the street quieter, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to breathe without that weight pressing forward, not because everything was fixed, but because everything was now visible, and visibility changes everything. I walked to my car slowly, not out of hesitation, but out of intention, because I understood that what had happened inside that house would continue long after I left, not as something hidden, but as something that would need to be faced, addressed, and reshaped. And that was no longer mine to control. I had done what I needed to do, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly, and clarity has a way of lasting longer than confrontation ever could. As I sat behind the wheel, I glanced once at the house, at the quiet windows, at the place that had once felt familiar, and then unfamiliar, and now something else entirely. And I realized that I did not feel anger. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt something simpler, something steadier. I felt certain, because I had not raised my voice. I had not forced a confession. I had not needed to. I had simply paid attention, long enough, carefully, enough. And when the moment came, I had placed the truth where it could not be ignored. And that is sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do. Not fight, not argue, but see clearly and refuse to look away. And as I started the car and pulled away from the curb, I understood that whatever happened next inside that house would not begin with me. But it had begun because of me, and that was enough. Because some battles are not won by breaking something apart. They are won by revealing what was already broken and letting the truth decide what remains.